This is Axis News Network. I'm Joel. Tonight, the world reacts to President Donald J. Trump's successful ceasefire deal, a breakthrough agreement that has, for the first time in months, silenced the guns across Israel and Gaza. After weeks of intense negotiations, President Trump announced that both Israel and Hamas have agreed to a comprehensive ceasefire, one that includes the release of remaining hostages, phased humanitarian access, and a framework for long-term regional stability. Speaking from the White House earlier today, the president called the agreement a victory for peace through strength and a moment that, in his words, proves that strong leadership and direct diplomacy can end wars that weak words never could. He emphasized that this ceasefire is not a temporary truce, but the foundation of what he described as a new security era in the Middle East, one built on accountability, coordination, and results. Under the terms of the deal, Israeli forces will gradually reposition from dense urban areas in Gaza while maintaining perimeter defense zones. In parallel, international monitors, coordinated by the United States, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, will oversee humanitarian corridors for food, water, and medical supplies. Hamas has committed to halting all rocket launches and cooperating with international observers to verify compliance. The United States, acting as both guarantor and enforcer, has made it clear that any violation of the ceasefire will trigger swift economic and diplomatic consequences. Across Washington, President Trump's announcement drew immediate attention. Lawmakers from both parties praised the administration's success in achieving what many had described as impossible, stopping a war that had already displaced millions and pushed the region to the brink of collapse. Vice President J.D. Vance, speaking from Capitol Hill, called it a demonstration of American resolve. The State Department said the agreement would be followed by a three-phase humanitarian plan led by U.S. logistical teams now stationed in Egypt, Cyprus, and Israel. International reaction came swiftly. In London, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak praised President Trump for what he called a decisive act of leadership that the world desperately needed. Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz said the deal offers Europe a critical window to deliver aid and rebuild civilian infrastructure. In the Middle East, Egypt and Qatar, two nations deeply involved in the negotiations, credited the U.S. team for keeping both sides at the table even as fighting intensified. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates have already pledged hundreds of millions of dollars toward immediate reconstruction efforts in Gaza, working in coordination with American agencies. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu hailed the ceasefire as a strategic win, saying his government achieved its goals and now enters a stage of stabilization. Israeli officials stressed that while military objectives were met, they remain ready to respond to any breach of the agreement. In Gaza, residents emerged from shelters for the first time in weeks. Streets once filled with smoke and debris are seeing convoys of humanitarian trucks, food, fuel, and medical aid, entering under international supervision. Doctors describe hospitals beginning to function again, and communications networks are being restored in several areas. President Trump's administration has outlined strict oversight for the relief operation. The U.S. military, working alongside Egyptian and Jordanian forces, will coordinate air and sea deliveries, ensuring supplies reach civilians directly and are not diverted by militant groups. In his statement, the president said, quote, "America will lead this mission not just with power, but with principle. We will feed the hungry, protect the innocent, and prevent evil from taking root again." Across Europe and Asia, global markets reacted positively to the ceasefire news. Energy prices dropped, and shipping insurers reduced risk premiums for Eastern Mediterranean trade routes. Analysts say the deal's immediate effect on regional stability has already brought economic relief from Tel Aviv to Istanbul. At the United Nations, a draft resolution has been introduced to formally endorse the Trump Peace Framework. Diplomats are calling it the most significant U.S.-brokered Middle East agreement in a generation, potentially rivaling the Abraham Accords of 2020 in impact. Still, world leaders caution that the coming weeks will determine whether the ceasefire holds. Humanitarian groups urge both sides to maintain restraint and ensure consistent access for aid convoys. The United Nations is deploying additional observers to Gaza's border crossings to monitor compliance in real time. President Trump, however, remains confident. In a follow-up statement tonight, he said, "The world has seen enough of endless wars. This ceasefire isn't the end of our involvement. It's the beginning of lasting peace through strength, backed by results." In Russia, the Kremlin cautiously welcomed the deal but criticized Western involvement as self-serving. In contrast, China's foreign ministry said it supports the agreement and urged all regional players to contribute constructively to reconstruction. The Vatican released a statement commending the U.S. for its leadership, calling the ceasefire a turning point for humanity's conscience. Back in Washington, the president's national security advisor told reporters that humanitarian operations are already scaling up. Over 500 aid trucks are now queued to enter Gaza through the Rafah and Kerem Shalom crossings, and U.S. Navy assets in the Mediterranean are on standby to deliver emergency medical units. Meanwhile, humanitarian corridors are being extended to reach isolated communities across northern Gaza. Aid workers report that clean water and electricity are slowly returning to major hospitals. The Trump administration's foreign policy team says this operation will continue for at least 60 days, with progress assessments delivered weekly. Around the world, reactions are still pouring in, from European parliaments to African Union members, all pointing to renewed faith in diplomacy through strength. For many global observers, this ceasefire marks the first moment of calm in what had become one of the most devastating conflicts in recent memory. In the streets of Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and Gaza City, civilians from both sides have been seen embracing relatives, returning to homes, and standing in long lines for food distributions organized under the U.S. mission. Tonight, President Trump is expected to hold a joint call with Prime Minister Netanyahu and Egypt's President El-Sisi to discuss the next steps of implementation. Officials tell Axis News that the conversation will focus on border security, rebuilding public infrastructure, and accelerating hostage release verification. Across America, polls show a surge in approval for the president's handling of the Middle East crisis. A majority of voters say they believe his administration restored U.S. credibility abroad and reaffirmed its global leadership role. Political analysts describe the ceasefire as both a diplomatic and strategic victory, underscoring the administration's principle that peace is best achieved through decisive action, not prolonged negotiation. For families on both sides of the conflict, hope is beginning to replace fear. As one Israeli woman told our correspondent tonight, "For the first time in months, we can hear silence, and silence is a blessing." In Gaza, a father who lost his home described it this way: "I just want my children to sleep through the night without waking to explosions. Maybe this time it will last." As the ceasefire enters its second full day, the question now is not whether it can hold, but whether this fragile calm can be transformed into lasting peace. This is Axis News Network. I'm Joel. Stay with us as we continue monitoring developments in Gaza, Jerusalem, and Washington, where the Trump administration is already working to turn today's truce into tomorrow's peace. You're watching Axis News Network. Your world, your news, your Axis. Stay informed, stay focused, and subscribe for verified coverage without the noise. I'm Joel. See you in the next update.